Stories of the Vorian War, 50 Miles to Pad 7, by R. A. Bose. Within the vast network of the United Federation of Humankind, stretching across 68 star systems linked by Elix Corporation's vital wormhole ring gates, the Lu system held little distinction. A G-type star, a scattering of planets. It served primarily as a peripheral node, a minor resource hub on the frontier. Its most defining features were the arid world of Naru and, orbiting it, the small, unassuming moon designated Vega. Vega offered little hospitality. Essentially a captured planetoid, it possessed negligible atmosphere and gravity barely a sixth of Earth standard. Its surface, a stark panorama of gray-brown regolith and impact-scarred rock, held value only beneath its dusty skin. Rich deposits of silicates and rare earth elements attracted Elix Corp., which established Prospector's Rest, mining colony 7C, a small, isolated outpost dedicated to extraction. Life in Prospector's Rest was defined by the harsh realities of the environment and the demands of the corporation. A few hundred souls, miners, technicians, families, inhabited interconnected, pressurized modules, their routines governed by shift schedules, equipment maintenance, and the regular arrival of supply ships via the Naru Ring Gate. Outside the fragile security of the habdomes, the vacuum enforced silence, broken only by the hum of machinery and the crunch of magnetized boots on lunar soil. Survival depended utterly on technology and the thin walls separating life from the void. Among the colony's inhabitants were the Reyes family, occupying Hab Unit 14B. 3 generations resided within its confines, their lives interwoven with the colony's rhythms. The patriarch Elias Reyes, a man whose 60-plus years were visibly marked by a lifetime working the mines, frequently voiced frustrations regarding Elix Corp quotas issued from Naru Command. His wife, Martha, provided a quiet counterpoint, her steady presence an anchor for the family amidst the regulated confines of their existence. She managed the household with practiced efficiency, preparing the standard fare of nutrient paste and rehydrated rations common on such outposts. Their son, Kale, followed his father into the mines. A man in his 30s, the weight of responsibility for his own family, his wife Lena and their 2 children, Maya and Finn, was evident in his bearing after long shifts wresting resources from Vega's depths. Lena Reyes often focused on maintaining a semblance of normalcy, particularly for the children. 8-year-old Finn could usually be found immersed in educational modules on a data slate, often clutching a cherished stuffed toy, a memento from a past off-world trip. His older sister, Maya, 16, exhibited the restlessness common among adolescents in such isolated environments, seeking escape through music beamed from the Federation's core worlds, dreaming of life beyond Vega's gray horizon. Their interactions painted a familiar portrait of family life, adapted to the unique pressures of a frontier mining colony. It was a predictable existence, seemingly secure within its engineered boundaries. This perception of security, however, proved tragically fragile. On Cycle Day 278, Federation Standard, year 3483, at approximately 1947 local Vega time, the predictable order of Prospector's Rest was irrevocably broken. The first indication was auditory, yet unlike any sound previously registered on the moon. Not the familiar whine of spacecraft or the rumble of mining explosives, but a penetrating, tearing shriek that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the colony, a profound violation of the near-vacuum silence felt deep within the inhabitants' bones. Inside Hab Unit 14B, as in modules across the colony, startled attention turned towards the source. Before comprehension could dawn, Vega itself convulsed. The impact was savage. It wasn't a geological tremor familiar to the miners, but a colossal concussive force striking the surface miles away, propagating upwards through the bedrock with brutal energy. The foundations of Prospector's Rest heaved, floors bucked violently, lighting systems flickered and failed, plunging modules into momentary darkness before emergency lights stuttered on. In the low gravity, unsecured objects became projectiles, ricocheting within the confined spaces. Across the colony, structural stress alarms shrieked, a cacophony of electronic distress signals. Within Hab Unit 14B, the Reyes family reacted instinctively to the sudden violence. Kale moved to shield Lena and young Finn as the module shuddered through a prolonged, grinding vibration. Maya cried out, clinging to furniture. Elias, visibly shaken, struggled to maintain his footing, initially uttering disbelief about the intensity of the seismic event. Panic became evident throughout the colony. External sensors and observation ports revealed figures stumbling from adjacent habs, some fumbling with emergency breathers. The sounds of distant structural collapse and tortured metal carried through the interconnecting passageways. Colony-wide communication channels dissolved into a chaos of static, fragmented reports, and shouted commands. Initial reports pinpointed a massive impact in Sector Delta 9, accompanied by colony-wide power fluctuations and reports of structural damage in outlying processing units. Miles from the relative safety of the colony, something of immense size and unknown origin had breached Vega's thin atmospheric envelope and impacted the surface with catastrophic force. The energy released sent shockwaves radiating through the moon's crust, crippling localized systems at Prospector's rest. Automated safety protocols struggled to respond. Power grids experienced cascading failures. Effective communication became momentarily impossible amidst the electronic noise and physical disruption. Miners working near the impact zone later reported witnessing a blinding flash moments before the ground erupted beneath them. Back in Hab Unit 14B, as the most violent shaking subsided into worrying tremors, the Reyes family assessed their immediate situation. Kale, relying on his miner's training, checked the integrity seals of their Hab module. Lena attempted to comfort the visibly frightened Finn, offering tentative explanations of a large meteorite impact. Maya moved to the reinforced window, reporting the sight of an enormous dust plume rising into the black sky miles away, dwarfing any known mining operation's signature. Elias Reyes, recovering his composure, clung to conventional explanations, suggesting a large meteor strike or, perhaps more cynically, derelict Helix Corp hardware falling from orbit. Familiar possibilities in this remote region. Kale Reyes, however, observing the scale of the dust cloud and recalling the unprecedented violence of the impact, reportedly exhibited signs of deep unease. He accessed the colony's strained emergency communication network, attempting to filter meaningful information from the surrounding chaos. In the colony's command center, Security Chief Marcus Thorne struggled to impose order and ascertain the facts. His initial log entry, time-stamped 1958 local, reflected the profound uncertainty of the moment, framed by years of managing more conventional incidents. It read, Incident 7 Gamma logged. Unidentified atmospheric entry and surface impact, vicinity Sector Delta 9. Significant seismic event recorded colony-wide. Suspected large geological event or non-hostile hardware failure. Minor structural damage reported. Power fluctuations ongoing. Assessment teams mobilizing. Situation uncertain. This initial assessment, based on available data and prior experience, failed to grasp the true nature of the event. It would soon become tragically clear that Incident 7 Gamma was neither geological nor accidental hardware failure. On the desolate plains of Vega, something utterly alien had arrived. The Vorian War, unannounced and unimagined by the inhabitants of this small moon, had begun, and the inhabitants of Prospector's Rest were among the first to come face to face with the terrifying ecosystem they brought with them. For the Reyes family and for all of the outpost, the ground had literally shifted beneath their feet. The dust from the impact still hung in the black sky, a silent, ominous portent of the terror to come. In the immediate hours following the violent impact in Sector Delta 9, a fragile, deceptive calm descended upon Prospector's Rest. The catastrophic tremors subsided, leaving behind the hum of emergency power, the incessant beeping of diagnostic alerts, and a profound sense of collective shock. Initial efforts focused inward, assessing structural damage to the interconnected habitat modules, accounting for personnel and attempting to restore full operational capacity. The external event, the cause of the chaos, remained a terrifying enigma miles out on the desolate plains of Vega. Communication lines with Naru Command, hampered initially by the impact's electromagnetic fallout, were gradually restored. Yet the information flowing back from the Lu system's primary administrative hub offered little comfort. Alex Corporation officials acknowledged the seismic readings, confirmed visual observation of the massive dust plume via orbital assets, but urged caution. Standard protocols were invoked: sensor sweeps, data analysis, cross-referencing with known celestial phenomena, and registered flight paths. It was a bureaucratic response, meticulous and measured, utterly incongruous with the visceral terror felt by those on the ground. For the inhabitants of Prospector's Rest, trapped beneath the silent gaze of the desert planet Naru, patience was a luxury rapidly evaporating. History would later reveal this cautious delay, this adherence to procedure in the face of the unprecedented, was tragically common during the Vore's initial incursions across the Federation frontier. The Vorian arrival pattern, the sudden, brutal descent of their biomechanical vessels, often mimicking natural disasters or catastrophic accidents, was designed, whether intentionally or incidentally, to sow confusion, exploit existing emergency protocols, and delay unified responses. Prospector's Rest, unknowingly, stood on the bleeding edge of this new, terrifying epoch. They possessed no framework, no prior reports, as the preceding tragedies were not being openly discussed by the High Council at the time. They had no concept of the biological horror that had landed mere miles away. They were interpreting the opening act of an interstellar war through the lens of meteor strikes and equipment failures. Security Chief Marcus Thorne, tasked with coordinating the colony's response, dispatched assessment teams towards the impact site. These teams, equipped with standard ground vehicles adapted for Vega's low gravity and thin atmosphere, soon encountered baffling obstacles. Their progress was hampered not by terrain, but by inexplicable sensor anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar, designed to map subsurface geology, returned chaotic, meaningless data near Sector Delta 9. Magnetometers registered fluctuating, non-standard energy fields pulsing irregularly from the impact zone, patterns inconsistent with any known natural phenomenon or Federation technology. Within HAB Unit 14B, Elias Reyes, overhearing fragments of these reports on the strained ComNet, clung stubbornly to his skepticism. "Sensor ghosts," he declared to his family. "Atmospheric interference from the dust cloud. Always happens. Needs recalibration, the lot of it." Yet his gruff pronouncements lacked their usual conviction. His son, Kyle, listening intently, felt only a deepening unease. The data, however fragmented, hinted at something profoundly wrong. Then came the silence. Automated relay. Post. Delta 12, a critical communications booster positioned strategically between the colony and the impact zone, abruptly ceased all transmissions approximately 3 standard hours after the initial event. Routine diagnostic signals vanished. Attempts by colony technicians to ping the relay or initiate remote resets met with dead air. Equipment failure was a plausible explanation. Vega's environment was notoriously harsh on delicate electronics, but the timing, coupled with the strange readings from the area, cast a sinister pall over this technical malfunction. For Kyle Reyes, the silence of Delta 12 felt less like a glitch and more like a severed connection, an isolation deepening around them. He found himself checking the seals on his family's emergency breathers, ensuring the oxygen tanks were full, actions driven by a growing, instinctual dread that defied easy explanation. Lena watched him, her attempts to reassure their young son, Finn, with cartoons on a data slate seeming increasingly fragile. Maya, their daughter, vibrated with frustrated energy, unable to sit still. "Why are we just waiting?" she pressed Kale. "Relay posts don't just die. We should be doing something." As the colony clock ticked over into the designated night cycle, a mere administrative distinction under the constant Naru light, a new visual anomaly emerged. Observers stationed at the colony's southern perimeter, scanning the horizon towards Sector Delta 9, began reporting a faint, ethereal blue luminescence. It clung close to the ground, barely perceptible at first against the gray regolith. Initial speculation ranged from static discharge in the lingering dust cloud to malfunctioning external lighting near the impact zone, perhaps even a previously undiscovered atmospheric interaction with Naru's radiation belt. These rationalizations, however, felt increasingly thin as the hours passed. The blue glow, though faint, seemed persistent, almost watchful. The first concrete indication that something actively hostile was unfolding came with the loss of Prospecting Team Alpha. Dispatched hours earlier under Chief Thorne's authority to get closer visual reconnaissance of the impact site, the three-person team had been providing intermittent, cautious reports. Their final transmission, received at 0412 colony time, was fragmented, broken by static and palpable panic. The words decipherable painted a chilling picture. Movement, fast, low to the ground, like lizards, multiple contacts, closing. Then only static. Further attempts to hail Team Alpha yielded nothing. They had vanished into the Vega night, swallowed by the unknown. Shortly after Team Alpha's final, desperate broadcast, reports from automated perimeter sensors began to change. The faint blue glow on the horizon was no longer static. It was spreading. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like spilled paint, it crept outwards from the impact epicenter. Simultaneously, motion detectors near the colony's southern edge began triggering sporadically, reporting fast-moving contacts that defied identification. Too small for vehicles, too fast and erratic for any known Vega fauna, which was virtually non-existent. The fate of automated cargo rover 7 offered a horrifying glimpse. The rover, returning from a routine supply drop at a remote sensor station, abruptly deviated from its programmed course as it passed near the spreading blue luminescence, several miles from the colony. Its external camera feed, monitored back at Prospector's Rest Control Center, transmitted a final, jarring sequence before cutting out entirely. The footage showed the rover's manipulator arm encountering a viscous, mucus-like substance coating the ground, a substance that glowed with the same subtle blue light seen on the horizon. Then shapes erupted from the surrounding rocks, low-slung quadrupedal creatures, moving with unnerving speed and agility, swarming the rover. The feed dissolved into chaos, showing glimpses of chitinous hides, snapping jaws, and the encroaching blue goo before terminating. The colonists had just witnessed their first encounter with what Federation forces would later grimly nickname Hell Dogs, the shock troops of the Vorian invasion. And the glowing blue substance? This was the Vorian biomechanical substrate, a terrifyingly efficient agent of planetary consumption. Its initial spread, as observed on Vega, was deceptively slow, perhaps only meters per hour. But embedded within its alien biology was the potential for terrifying exponential growth. Fed by the biological and mineral resources it consumed, its rate of expansion would increase dramatically over time, eventually capable of engulfing entire continents, then worlds. The Hell Dogs served as its protectors, its scouts, eliminating resistance and herding potential bioresources towards the advancing tide. On Vega, the colonists had no inkling of this horrific symbiosis. They saw only baffling lights, strange creatures, and escalating disappearances. Panic, previously simmering beneath the surface, now threatened to boil over in Prospector's Rest. Security Chief Thorne ordered a colony-wide lockdown, sealing external hatches and restricting movement between sections. But information control was breaking down. Rumors spread like wildfire through the internal comms and data networks. Tales of monsters, alien lights, missing teams. Some colonists demanded immediate evacuation. Others argued for fortifying the HABs, believing rescue from Naru was imminent. The official Elix Corp directives remained frustratingly passive. Maintain lockdown, monitor the situation, await further instructions. Inside HAB Unit 14B, the tension was palpable. Kale Reyes now moved with grim purpose, laying out emergency supplies, water packs, nutrient bars, the small medkit, extra oxygen canisters. Elias finally fell silent, his skepticism extinguished by the undeniable evidence of catastrophe filtering through the comm channels. Martha gathered precious family data chips, her face etched with worry. Lena held Finn tightly, whispering reassurances that neither of them believed. Maya stood by the reinforced window, staring towards the southern horizon, where the blue glow was now unmistakably brighter, a menacing stain spreading across their world. It was then, amidst the rising fear and confusion, that the message finally arrived from Naru Command. It wasn't a calm directive, but a fragmented, high-priority emergency broadcast, clearly patched through under duress from the Lugate control nexus. The transmission spoke of simultaneous unexplained incidents on other peripheral Federation worlds. It mentioned hostile non-human organisms, biomechanical substrate, and, chillingly, confirmed the incidents as part of a coordinated alien invasion. The voice on the comm, strained and bordering on panic, issued a stark command. All Federation personnel on Vega, immediate emergency evacuation. Rendezvous point designated Emergency Landing Pad 7, coordinates Grid Sierra Tango 44-89. All available transport proceed immediately. Evacuate. Repeat. Evacuate now. Pad 7 was an old decommissioned emergency field, 50 arduous miles south across the open moonscape. The evacuation order, when it finally came, was tragically late. Chaos erupted within Prospector's rest. The lockdown became irrelevant as hatches were forced open. A desperate scramble began for the colony's limited pool of ground vehicles, personnel carriers, mining trucks, maintenance crawlers. But the Vorian presence was no longer miles away. Unseen attackers, the swift and deadly hell dogs, struck at the colony perimeter as the first vehicles attempted to leave. Blaster fire, ineffective against their speed and numbers, echoed futilely. Because the Federation had been reluctant to share data, they did not yet know that flamethrowers were the optimal weapon against the encroaching Vore. Explosions marked the destruction of several vehicles swarmed just beyond the main gates. The routes south were already becoming contested ground. For the Reyes family caught in the surge of panicked colonists towards the vehicle bays, the realization dawned swiftly and brutally: there would be no transport for them. The available vehicles were instantly overwhelmed, commandeered by the quickest, the strongest, or the most ruthless. They were stranded. Outside, the sounds of conflict grew louder. The blue glow on the horizon seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The 50-mile trek to Pad 7, their only lifeline, would have to be made on foot. The whispers and shadows had coalesced into tangible, deadly threats, and the long, desperate walk into the Vega night was about to begin. For the Reyes family, Kale, Lena, the traumatized Finn, the stunned Maya, the grieving Martha, and the grimly determined Elias, the reality became brutally clear within minutes. Hemmed in by the frantic crowd, pushed back from the overloaded vehicles, they watched their chance of a mechanized escape evaporate. Any remaining functioning vehicles were quickly swarmed, their departure routes immediately challenged. The sounds filtering in from outside the main colony airlocks shifted from panicked shouts to the unmistakable, terrifying staccato of weapon fire. Small arms, likely security personnel, attempting a futile defense, answered by unearthly shrieks and the crunching sound of metal yielding to immense force. Reports crackled over unsecured channels. "They're at the perimeter! Vehicles down near Gate 3! Creatures everywhere!" The Vorian hell dogs, swift and savage, were already closing the net. It was Kale Reyes who made the stark, unavoidable decision, his voice cutting through his family's dazed fear. "We walk," he stated, his face pale but set. "There's no other way. Pad 7 south. We follow the old pipeline markers." There was no time for debate, no room for denial. Survival now depended on immediate action and sheer endurance. Retreating briefly to the relative sanctuary of Hab Unit 14B, they gathered essentials with frantic haste. Actions became mechanical, driven by adrenaline and the dawning horror of their situation. Water packs were filled and strapped on. Nutrient paste tubes, dense with calories but tasting like cardboard, were stuffed into pockets. Kale secured the small emergency medkit and checked the charge on his mining laser pistol, a tool designed for cutting rock, not engaging biological horrors, but it was the only weapon they possessed. Lena packed extra oxygen canisters and ensured Finn's breather mask fit snugly, tucking his faded star lizard toy into his pack, a small anchor to a world that no longer existed. Maya, her youthful defiance replaced by wide-eyed shock, shouldered a heavy supply pack without complaint. Martha, moving as if in a dream, clutched a small data chip containing decades of family photos. Elias, his earlier skepticism, now a forgotten memory, hefted his old mining pickaxe, its weighted head gleaming dully under the emergency lights, a symbol of his life's work, now repurposed as a desperate, primitive weapon. They sealed their abandoned Hab unit behind them, the hiss of the airlock a final, mournful sigh. Stepping out into the main corridor, they joined a growing trickle of other families, other individuals, who had reached the same grim conclusion. Small, burdened figures, encased in environment suits or hastily donned emergency breathers, began moving towards the southern airlocks, their faces invisible behind reflective visors, united only by their shared desperation and the southward direction of their impossible hope. The transition from the besieged colony to the open surface of Vega was jarring. One moment they were surrounded by the echoing chaos of human panic. The next, they stepped into the profound, indifferent silence of the moonscape. The low gravity, roughly 1/6 of Earth's, made movement feel strangely buoyant, yet required conscious effort to control, especially laden with packs. Each footstep crunched loudly on the fine regolith, the sound seeming unnaturally amplified in the near vacuum. Above them, the black sky was absolute, dominated by the looming ochre disk of Naru. Its reflected light cast long, eerie shadows from the sparse rock formations scattered across the plains. Behind them, the sounds of conflict at Prospector's Rest were already fading, replaced by the unnerving quiet of the vast, empty landscape ahead. Their journey, 50 miles on foot across an airless, hostile world, had begun. They followed the faint, illuminated markers of Pipeline Route 7, an old, decommissioned conduit that snaked southward towards the vicinity of Pad 7. The pipeline itself was long buried or salvaged, but its route markers, designed for automated maintenance drones, still pulsed with low energy, providing a desperately needed guide across the featureless terrain. The initial stage of the trek was characterized by a tense, hurried pace. Fear propelled them forward, fear of the unknown horrors spreading behind them, fear of the vast emptiness ahead, fear of the dwindling time before the evacuation ships potentially departed Pad 7 without them. Kyle pushed them relentlessly, scanning the landscape, urging them onward. Conversation was minimal, practicality dictating preservation of breath and energy. Only Finn's occasional whimpers, muffled by his breather, broke the rhythm of their crunching footsteps and strained breathing. They walked through the day-lit night of the moon, walking until it felt like their legs were about to fall off. Throughout, the children would request to be carried. The adults would oblige for as long as they could. Then they would be forced to walk on their own again. Behind them, not as far as they would have liked it to have been, was the luminescent blue hue of the encroaching Vorian goo that crept across the ground, devouring anything unlucky enough to contain life, flanked by the hell dogs that protected it from interference. They were perhaps 25 miles south of Prospector's Rest, seeking temporary shelter from Naru's direct glare behind a cluster of jagged, obsidian-like rocks during a scheduled rest break, when the fragile illusion of safety shattered. There was no warning sound, no visual cue in the stark landscape. One moment they were sipping recycled water and checking oxygen levels. The next, shapes erupted from the shadowed fissures between the rocks. The Vorian hell dogs moved with terrifying speed and coordination, low-slung, quadrupedal, their chitinous hides blending almost perfectly with the dark rocks. They burst into the small clearing the family occupied. Estimates based on later encounters suggest these creatures possess exceptional camouflage abilities and senses highly attuned to movement and perhaps biosignatures, allowing them to ambush prey with devastating effectiveness. Their one flaw was that they would never travel too far ahead of there. Chaos exploded in the low gravity. Kale reacted instantly, shoving Lena and Finn behind a larger boulder and firing his laser pistol. The beam, designed to superheat and fracture rock, sizzled against the tough hide of the lead creature, causing it to recoil with a screech but inflicting no apparent serious injury. Maya screamed, scrambling backwards. Martha stumbled, falling against the dusty ground. It was Finn, small and terrified, who tripped near the edge of their rocky alcove, directly in the path of a lunging hell dog, its jaws snapping open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Elias Reyes reacted with the pure, primal instinct of a protector. Roaring a challenge that was likely inaudible outside his own helmet, he charged forward, swinging his heavy pickaxe in a wide arc. Decades of wielding the tool against stubborn rock gave power to the blow. The weighted point connected solidly with the creature attacking Finn, punching through its carapace with a sickening crunch. The hell dog convulsed and collapsed, momentarily disrupting the attack. But Elias's act of bravery left him exposed. Before he could recover his stance, two more creatures swarmed him. His pickaxe clattered uselessly to the ground. His final shout, transmitted raggedly over their short-range suit comms, was a mixture of defiance and sheer terror. Kale, Lena, and Maya could only watch in helpless horror as Elias disappeared beneath a frenzy of claws and snapping jaws. "Dad, no!" Kyle screamed, aiming his pistol again, but the creatures were a blur of motion, their attack on Elias swift and brutally final. He knew, with agonizing certainty, that firing into the melee was futile and risked hitting his father. He had to get the others out. "Move! Now!" he yelled, grabbing Finn, who was frozen in shock, and physically pulling him back. He hauled Martha, sobbing uncontrollably, to her feet. He shoved Maya, her face a mask of disbelief and horror, towards the open plain beyond the rocks. "Run! Don't look back!" Leaving Elias behind was an act of unimaginable agony, a tearing of the family fabric. But hesitation meant death. Driven by Kyle's desperate commands and the terrifying proximity of the remaining hell dogs, momentarily occupied with their fallen packmate and their victim, the surviving Reyes family scrambled away from the rocks, fleeing southward across the gray dust. They did not dare look back at the scene of sacrifice, the sounds of the Vore fading behind them, replaced only by Martha's heart-wrenching sobs transmitted over the comms and the ragged sound of their own panicked breathing. The death of Elias Reyes marked a brutal turning point. The patriarch, the family's anchor of stubborn resilience, was gone. His loss was not just emotional but practical. They had lost his strength, his experience, and a vital part of their collective will. The remaining family pressed onward, but their dynamic was irrevocably altered. Kyle, now the sole adult male, assumed leadership not by choice but by grim necessity. His face became a hardened mask, his commands curt, his focus narrowed to the single, ruthless objective of reaching Pad 7. Martha was inconsolable, stumbling forward in a state of shock, kept moving only by Kyle's relentless urging and Lena's supporting arm. Lena, though grieving herself, turned her attention inward, trying desperately to shield Finn from the full horror, though the boy had retreated into a near catatonic silence, his eyes wide and vacant. Maya walked numbly beside Kyle, the trauma seeming to have aged her years in mere moments, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon, fury and fear warring in her young eyes. The 50-mile journey had claimed its first victim. 25 miles remained, and behind them, the eerie blue glow of the Vorian substrate seemed to pulse brighter against the blackness, a tangible manifestation of the encroaching doom they were so desperately trying to outrun. The brutal death under the claws of the Vorian hell dogs fundamentally altered the already desperate flight of the surviving family members. Grief, raw and consuming, became a suffocating shroud added to the weight of their packs and the burden of their fear. Yet the unforgiving landscape of Vega offered no respite, no time for mourning. Prospector's rest lay miles behind them, a besieged point of origin now swallowed by distance and the encroaching unknown. Ahead lay the desolate, indifferent plains and the dwindling hope represented by Emergency Landing Pad 7, still an agonizing distance away. The journey devolved into a grueling test of endurance, pushing the limits of human physiology and psychological resilience. Vega's low gravity, initially almost a novelty, became an insidious drain. While it made lifting feet easier, maintaining balance, controlling momentum, and navigating uneven terrain required constant, wearying muscular compensation. Fatigue settled deep into their bones, amplified by inadequate rest periods snatched in the bleak shadows of rock formations. Water discipline became paramount. The recycled water in their packs was finite, and dehydration in the near vacuum, even within their suits, was a constant threat, leaching strength and impairing judgment. Nutrient paste provided calories but little comfort, a bland fuel for increasingly exhausted bodies. The psychological toll was perhaps even more corrosive than the physical strain. The monotonous gray landscape, unchanging mile after mile under the perpetual, eerie illumination of Naru, offered no distraction, only endless space for fear and grief to fester. Every shadow seemed to writhe with imagined threats. Every distant geological formation took on the momentary silhouette of a lurking hell dog. Silence itself became oppressive, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing over the suit comms, the crunch of their boots on the regolith, and the occasional heart-stopping skittering sound carried on the thin, near vacuum, impossible to pinpoint, suggesting pursuit always just beyond the range of sight. This growing sense of being hunted was not mere paranoia. The Vorian presence on Vega was expanding, consolidating its foothold with terrifying speed. The faint blue luminescence previously observed on the distant horizon had intensified, spreading outwards from the Sector Delta 9 impact site like a luminous, predatory stain. It was now clearly visible as a significant arc of eerie light painting the landscape behind them, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach towards the fleeing survivors. Its visible growth served as a relentless visual countdown, a tangible measure of the closing distance between them and the alien horror. Sightings of the hell dogs, though still infrequent and distant, became more common among those fleeing. A fleeting glimpse of movement along a ridgeline miles away, a pack silhouette briefly visible against the Naru-lit sky before vanishing into a depression. These sightings forced exhausting detours, adding precious time and miles to their already desperate trek, pushing their dwindling energy reserves closer to depletion. The creatures seemed to be patrolling, perhaps establishing a perimeter, or maybe simply drawn by the faint biosignatures of the fleeing humans across the otherwise barren moonscape. Within the Reyes family unit, the strain manifested in different, damaging ways. Cale Reyes, burdened by the loss of his father and the weight of sole leadership, became increasingly withdrawn, his interactions pared down to essential commands. Keep moving. Check your oxygen. Rest here. His focus narrowed to the exclusion of almost everything else, a grim automaton driven by the singular imperative of reaching Pad 7. The warmth and patience he once possessed seemed cauterized by trauma and responsibility, leaving a hollowed-out determination that bordered on ruthlessness. Lena Reyes struggled to maintain a semblance of maternal care, focusing her energy almost entirely on young Finn. The boy remained deeply withdrawn, often unresponsive, clutching his faded star lizard toy as if it were the last piece of reality in a nightmare world. He rarely spoke, his wide eyes reflecting the horrors he had witnessed. Lena's attempts to soothe him, to engage him, were met with silence, a constant heart-wrenching reminder of the psychological wounds inflicted. While she tried to offer support to her grieving mother-in-law, Martha, Lena's own reserves were critically low, stretched thin between caring for Finn and managing her own fear and exhaustion. Maya, the teenage daughter who had once dreamed of escaping Vega's monotony, now moved with the grim competence of a seasoned survivor. The shock of her grandfather's death had forged a hard resolve within her. She walked beside Cale, her gaze constantly scanning the terrain, reporting potential hazards or distant movements with quiet efficiency. She helped manage supplies, checked Finn's suit seals, and shouldered an increasing share of the physical burden without complaint. Her youth seemed to have evaporated under the harsh Vega sky, replaced by a weary, watchful maturity born of profound loss and imminent danger. Cale appreciated that she could rise to the occasion, but it was Martha Reyes who deteriorated most rapidly. The shock of witnessing Elias's horrific death had shattered her emotionally. Grief manifested as a crushing weight, slowing her steps, dimming the light in her eyes. She moved mechanically, often stumbling, her responses sluggish. The physical demands of the trek exacerbated her condition. Labored breathing rasped over the comm channel. She lagged further and further behind, despite Lena's support and Cale's increasingly impatient urgings to keep pace. She was fading, physically and spiritually consumed by loss and the unrelenting harshness of the journey. The breaking point came approximately 40 miles into their trek, during a planned crossing of a treacherous field of fractured rock and loose scree. Martha, weakened and perhaps disoriented by fatigue and dehydration, caught her foot on an unstable slab of rock. In Vega's low gravity, the fall was deceptively slow but uncontrollably awkward. She landed heavily, her cry of pain sharp and immediate over the comms. Cale and Maya rushed back to her side. The diagnosis was swift and devastating. Her lower leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the jagged edge of broken bone threatening to pierce her suit fabric. A compound fracture. On Earth, a serious but treatable injury. On the desolate plains of Vega, miles from aid, pursued by alien predators, it was a death sentence. Panic flared anew. Kyle, his hardened exterior cracking, knelt beside his mother, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, Mom, okay. We'll splint it. We can make a stretcher." Maya frantically searched the medkit for painkillers and stabilization wraps. Lena hovered nearby, her face pale, trying to shield Finn from the sight. But even as Coyle spoke, the impossibility of the situation settled upon them like the fine Vega dust. Carrying Martha, even in low gravity, would slow their pace to a crawl. They could hear it now, a faint, intermittent chittering sound carried on the thin atmosphere, seemingly closer than before. Looking back, the blue glow seemed to have surged, painting the northern horizon with an undeniable intensity. Time was running out. The evacuation ships at Pad 7 would not wait forever. It was Martha, pale and trembling with pain, but startlingly lucid, who recognized the brutal calculus of their survival. She reached out, gripping Cale's arm, her voice weak but firm over the comms. "No, Cale, no stretcher." "Mom, we're not leaving you," Cale protested, his voice breaking. "Listen to me," Martha insisted, her gaze locking with his. "You can't carry me, not fast enough. You know this." She looked past him towards Lena and the children. "Save them. Save Maya. Save Finn." Lena sobbed, pleading, "Martha, no, we can—" "Lena," Martha interrupted gently but firmly. She fumbled at her side pouch and retrieved the small data chip containing their family history. She pressed it into Lena's trembling hand. "Take this. Tell them. Tell Finn. About Vega. About Elias. About before." Her gaze swept over her remaining family, lingering on Finn's small, still form. "Go now. Don't waste time. Please." The decision was agonizing, unthinkable, yet unavoidable. Cale knelt beside her, his helmet touching hers, words failing him. Maya stood frozen, tears streaming silently behind her visor. Lena clutched the data chip, her body shaking with sobs. Martha squeezed Kyle's hand one last time. "I love you all. Now go. Please. Survive." Leaving his mother propped against a cold, gray rock in the middle of the Vega wasteland was the hardest thing Kale had ever done. He left her with a full water pack and the single emergency flare from their kit, futile gestures against the inevitable. Then he turned his back. He pulled Lena away. He nudged Maya forward. He guided the silent Finn. He forced them southward, away from his mother, away from the encroaching blue glow, towards the distant, desperate hope of Pad 7. They did not look back. They couldn't bear to see her become a solitary, diminishing figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, awaiting the horrors they fled. Over their comms there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the crushing weight of silence where Martha's voice had been. The family, already fractured, was broken further. 20 miles remained, and hope, like their oxygen supply, felt perilously finite. The final 10 miles of the Reyes family's harrowing trek across the surface of Vega became a desperate race against converging threats: dwindling oxygen supplies, profound physical and emotional exhaustion, and the terrifyingly visible advance of the Vorian presence behind them. Leaving Martha behind, a sacrifice demanded by the brutal logic of survival, had inflicted another deep wound. Yet it also spurred them onward with renewed, agonized urgency. Every stumbling step southward was now measured against the encroaching blue luminescence that painted an ever larger swath of the northern horizon, a tangible manifestation of the alien tide they fled. Hope, however frail, flickered in the distance. The navigational beacons of emergency landing pad 7, initially just faint electronic whispers on Kale's wrist display, grew stronger. Soon they became visible to the naked eye, harsh artificial lights cutting through the perpetual twilight cast by Naru, stark against the black Vega sky. The sight offered a surge of adrenaline, a primal pull towards sanctuary. Yet the distance remained deceivingly vast across the broken, cratered terrain. Each rise negotiated, each dust-filled depression crossed, seemed to barely diminish the remaining miles, stretching their endurance to the absolute breaking point. Finn, still wrapped in a shell of trauma, had to be half-carried by Lena and Maya during the final stages, his small legs unable to keep pace. Kale, pushing himself relentlessly, monitored their oxygen levels with growing alarm. The thin red warning indicators began to flash on their suit displays. As they crested the final low ridge overlooking the designated coordinates, the scene at Pad 7 exploded into view. A pocket of frantic, desperate activity carved into the desolate landscape. Powerful floodlights cast stark shadows, illuminating several utilitarian transport ships of varying sizes, grounded on the hardened landing field. Figures moved with desperate haste around the vessels. Federation personnel in military fatigues, organizing boarding lines, harried civilian evacuees scrambling towards ramps, droids hauling last-minute supplies. The air, thin as it was, carried the thrumming vibration of powerful ship engines warming up and the sharp, staccato crackle of energy weapon fire. A defensive perimeter had clearly been established. Blaster bolts intermittently lanced out from fortified positions around the pad, aimed into the surrounding darkness from which emerged the high-pitched, chittering screeches of the Vorian hell dogs. Pad 7 was not a safe haven. It was an island under siege, a final point of contested departure. The challenge now was to cross the final mile of open, exposed ground, separating them from the relative safety of the perimeter lights, under the very real threat of interception by the Vorian creatures drawn to the activity. Kale urged his family into a stumbling run, their movements awkward and agonizingly slow in the low gravity, lungs burning, bodies screaming protest. Almost there. Keep moving! Together! His voice, ragged and strained, crackled over the comms. They were mere hundreds of yards from the nearest defensive emplacement when the attack came. Shapes detached themselves from the surrounding gloom, moving with the terrifying fluid speed the family now knew too well. A pack of hell dogs, perhaps drawn by their movement or flanking the main perimeter assault, burst from behind a cluster of shadowed rocks directly into their path. Panic seized the small group. Lena screamed, pulling Finn behind her. Maya instinctively raised her arms defensively. Cale reacted instantly, shoving his family towards the lights of the pad while turning to face the threat, raising his nearly depleted mining laser pistol. He fired twice, the beam searing the regolith near the lead creature, momentarily making it hesitate. It bought them precious seconds, but it wasn't enough. Another hell dog, flanking Cale's line of sight, lunged from the side. Cale twisted, bringing the pistol around, but the creature was too fast. Claws raked across his thigh, tearing through the suit fabric, eliciting a sharp cry of pain as vacuum hissed briefly before emergency sealant foamed over the breach. He stumbled, falling heavily to one knee, the laser pistol spinning from his grasp. Seeing Cale fall, Lena and Maya reacted without thought. Ignoring the nearby monsters, Lena grabbed Cale under one arm while Maya seized the other. Driven by pure adrenaline, they half-dragged, half-carried their injured father and husband towards the nearest boarding ramp, Finn stumbling alongside them. Behind them, concentrated blaster fire erupted from the perimeter as Federation Marines engaged the pursuing hell dogs, covering their desperate final approach. "Move it! Civilians coming in!" A voice bellowed from the ramp of a mid-sized transport ship, its engines whining at near-peak power. Weary but heavily armed Marines provided covering fire, then reached down, hauling the 4 Reyes survivors up the ramp just as the hell dogs closed in on their previous position. The heavy ramp slammed shut with a resounding thud, sealing them inside, sealing out the chaos and the horrors of the Vega plains. They made their way to any open seat that they could find and strapped themselves in, breathing heavily. They could hear the sound of hell dogs crashing into the hull outside, trying to force their way in. Moments later, the deck plating vibrated intensely as the ship's engines roared, lifting it rapidly from the besieged landing pad, leaving the desperate battle and the consumed moon behind. Inside the transport, the conditions were cramped, chaotic, and heavy with the palpable scent of fear and exhaustion. Dim emergency lighting illuminated rows of pale, stunned faces. Other survivors plucked from the jaws of the Vega disaster. The air hummed with the ship's engines and the low murmur of hushed conversations, punctuated by occasional sobs or the sharp commands of the military crew trying to maintain order. Kyle Reyes slumped against a bulkhead, his face contorted in pain, as a Marine medic administered rudimentary first aid to his bleeding leg, injecting painkillers and applying a pressure bandage. Lena knelt beside him, holding his hand, her face streaked with tears and grime, her gaze distant. She held Finn tightly in her lap. The boy remained unnervingly silent, staring blankly at the bulkhead, clutching his star lizard. Maya, separated slightly from her family by the crowded conditions, found her way to one of the small, reinforced viewports set into the ship's hull. She pressed her face close, peering out as the transport gained altitude, banking sharply as it accelerated towards orbit and the relative safety of the Naru Gate transit corridor. Below, the surface of Vega receded. From this vantage point, the scale of the disaster was terrifyingly apparent. The blue luminescence was no longer just an arc on the horizon. It was a vast, spreading stain of eerie light engulfing the area where Prospector's rest had stood. Tendrils reaching out across the gray plains like some phosphorescent planetary infection. It pulsed with a slow, cold light, utterly alien and implacably consuming the world she had once called home. The scattered lights of Pad 7 looked like a tiny, flickering ember about to be extinguished by a rising tide of blue darkness. A few days later, the ship shuddered as it entered the Naruian atmosphere, the image of their lost world dissolving into the swirling inferno that engulfed the ship on its descent. Cale, Lena, Maya, and Finn Reyes were 4 individuals among the few hundred souls who managed to escape Vega alive. before it was entirely overrun by the Vorian invaders. They had survived the 50-mile trek, a journey marked by unimaginable loss and acts of desperate courage. They carried with them the immediate physical wound Kale sustained, but far deeper were the invisible scars etched onto their minds. The trauma of witnessing death, the agony of impossible choices, the gnawing guilt of survival, and the chilling memory of the encroaching blue tide and the creatures it commanded. Their ordeal on Vega was not unique. It was an echo, one of the first terrifying reverberations of a conflict that would soon engulf vast swaths of the United Federation of Humankind. The stories from the Vorian War are filled with such accounts, tales whispered in refugee camps, logged in grim after-action reports, remembered in the haunted eyes of survivors. They are stories of ordinary people caught in the path of an extraordinary, existential threat. Stories of families shattered, worlds lost, and the terrible, enduring price of survival against an enemy that consumed everything it touched. The Reyes family had escaped the dust and echoes of Vega, but they, like countless others, would forever carry the weight of what they had seen and endured during the opening, nightmarish salvos of the Vorian War.